So for the third lesson of this unit, we are going to discuss the 1500s and the many attempted colonies that the English, the Spanish, and the French attempted to set up in North America in the 1500s, and why almost all of them failed. Um, so we will begin as usual with our goals for this lecture, and the goals of this class are. I want you to be able to explain the failure of European colonies in the 1500s. Why is it that the Spanish were able to succeed in, for instance, conquering the Aztec Empire in 1521, but all the major European powers were not able to set up basic functioning colonies in North America in the 1500s? And so we're going to look at a number of different examples, and I'll try to keep this lecture a little bit quicker because lecture 2 I know was quite long. So let us begin. So first, there's some important background that I think we need to know before discussing the examples of sort of different colonies in the 1500s. So first thing to know is that North America is densely inhabited on the coasts by Native Americans. Not only by the Wampanoag and the Narragansett, but also by the Powhatan Confederacy, which we'll talk about especially in the next unit. And the other key fact is that Native Americans know of Europeans. They have seen European fishermen come near the coast all throughout the late 1400s and early 1500s, and they regularly trade with them from their ships. So this isn't a situation where the Europeans show up and, coastal ocean-going Native American nations are shocked at their huge ships or anything. No, they regularly trade with Europeans. And so they're not surprised when Europeans attempt to show up and build colonies there. The other key thing is that the 1500s is a time of significant tension and religious conflict in Europe. You have Martin Luther, who begins the Protestant Reformation and begins a critique of the Catholic Church. And this breaks Christianity up into a bunch of different sects that all fight against each other. And this leads to a period of significant tension and religious conflict in Europe. And this sort of religious conflict actually comes to North America and is fought in North America as well. And we'll talk about a few instances of that. So with that background out of the way, let's start our tour of failed colonies in North America in the 1500s. So our first stop of the tour is going to be looking at Florida. So again, around the same time that Hernan Cortez is successfully conquering the Aztec Empire, there is an attempt by Ponce de Leon to set up a colony in Florida. So Ponce de Leon first explores around Florida in 1513 and encounters the Calusa people, who are people who live on the coast of modern-day southwest Florida, and engages in a brief sort of naval fight. People shooting each other with arrows from ships, and then Ponce de Leon quickly retreats and says, "Forget it. We're not going to engage in this exploration." But he comes back in 1521. And he comes with 200 men, 50 horses, and tools for farming. And Ponce de Leon is attempting to set up a colony in Florida. Well, when he arrives in Calusa territory, the Calusa people there immediately recognize the threat and attack Ponce de Leon and effectively drive him off. They defeat this force of 200 men. And Ponce de Leon himself is hit by a poison dart and is actually killed by the Calusa shortly thereafter. He succumbs to his injuries and wounds in Cuba. And this leads the Spanish to abandon Florida colonization for over a decade. So, again, this is another sort of uh, piece of historical evidence that perhaps Hernan Cortez and his followers were actually quite lucky in their conquering of the Aztec Empire, because Ponce de Leon's failure is actually much more common for the Spanish and for Europeans at this time. So next, we will take a look at the colony of San Miguel de Guadalupe. Um, and this colony was established in Guale territory on the coast of modern-day Georgia. Now, the Guale were a Mississippian people who lived on the coast. In the late 1600s, they, along with many other peoples, became the Yamasis, who would fight the colony of South Carolina in a series of wars in the 1700s. Um, so the Spanish arrived in on the coast of Georgia, with around 600 people, including women, children, and some of the first enslaved Africans on the North American continent. And this was really a poor site for a town, because there was porous soil, which led to the settlers not properly taking care of the water supply and actually contaminating their own water supply, which led to an outbreak of dysentery in the settlement. There was the population suffered greatly from hunger. They didn't come with enough food, and a cold autumn at the time made conditions significantly worse. There was also fighting between two camps of Spanish settlers, and this actually led to sort of violent conflicts between the settlers themselves. And eventually, these desperate settlers who were starving to death, suffering from dysentery, wander into the villages of the Guale who live nearby, and they start demanding food from the Guale. And the Guale simply kill them, say, we don't have any food for you, get away from us. This sort of desperate condition actually leads to the first slave rebellion against enslavers, as the enslaved Africans rebel against the Spanish, burning down a house. The settlement of San Miguel de Guadalupe is then shortly abandoned thereafter, with starvation and cold killing many of the people on the trip back to the Caribbean. And actually, only 150 out of the 600 people of the original settlers end up actually surviving. So again, you have another instance of this failed colony, another failed colony in the 1500s by the Spanish. Another settlement that was established by Europeans was that of Fort Caroline, which was established by French Huguenots in 1564 around modern-day Jacksonville, Florida. Now, the Huguenots were a Protestant sect that who joined both the Protestant Reformation and sought to practice Christianity differently from Catholics. And this settlement that was established was actually initially quite successful. The French Huguenots were able to make contact with a local Timucua village that was led by a person named Saturia, and began trading with Saturia. And then another Timucuan village, which was led by Saturia's rival, Otina, reached out and began both a trading relationship and also an alliance with the French Huguenots. And this was where, again, Europeans sort of show up into a native world that has its own set of alliances and its own set of different relationships. And so the Timucuans were a group of people who um, descend again from these mound building cultures that have these centralized villages, um, and generally dense populations, but they have different sort of groups that are often rivals to each other. And so Otina, one of these Timucuan leaders, wants to bring the French Huguenots into an alliance with him, because they can sort of advantage from French trade goods, like, for instance, metal tools, metal weapons, these sorts of things. And so Otina actually publicizes his alliance with the French Huguenots, and in some ways actually almost forces the French to sort of fight his enemies with him. And so the French, because they need the food of Otina's villages, sort of agree to go along with this. And so the French start fighting against Saturia and other factions of the Temecula, who oppose Otina. And this leads the French to get sort of intermeshed in this native politics and used by savvy native leaders, who are seeking sort of wealth and glory for themselves. And it's around this time, actually, that the Spanish get involved, because this French settlement is established in Florida, which is not too far away from the Spanish settlements of the Caribbean. And the Spanish are actually informed by Saturia that this French Huguenot settlement exists nearby. And of course, the Spanish are militantly Catholic. They vehemently disagree with the Protestant Reformation, and so they view these French Huguenots as heretics, and they want to wipe them out. And sure enough, the Spanish are actually able, using intelligence gathered by Saturia, to find this French settlement and destroy it. And they destroy Fort Caroline and kill all of the Huguenots who live there, effectively wiping out one of France's first colonies in North America. Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who led this campaign against the French, and was responsible for the massacre of the French Huguenots, writes in his own journal, on the 28th of September, the Indians notified me that many Frenchmen were about 6 leagues from here on the coast, and that they had lost their vessels and escaped by swimming in boats. And then he found them and again destroyed the settlement. And so this again shows how Europeans are arriving in native spaces where native leaders have power and control, and they know what's happening in the areas around them. And so Europeans are dependent not only on native nations for food, but also for information and intelligence, in order to fight their other European enemies. And the Spanish themselves actually set up their own colony near modern day Jacksonville, which they call St. Augustine. They established it in 1565. And despite that sort of temporary alliance they had with Saturia, they very quickly get into conflicts with the local Timucuans. And their initial settlements actually burnt down by Saturia, and the Timucuans, in 1566. But unlike the French, the Spanish have existing colonies nearby, and this allows them to more easily reinforce their colonies in Florida. And so they relocate St. Augustine to a nearby location, and they're able to build a fort there and effectively maintain a presence in Florida. But even then, it's constantly this settlement is constantly raided and attacked by the English and the French and the Timucuans. Um, However, due to the fact that they're able to constantly reinforce the settlement, help defend the settlement with ships, they're able to actually maintain St. Augustine. And St. Augustine does become the oldest colony in North America, that survives and survives as a city today. So the English also attempted to set up colonies in North America around this time. And one of these colonies you may have heard of was that of Roanoke. Now, the story of the disappearance and the mystery of what happened to the Roanoke colony is actually a story about the third Roanoke colony that was established. Um, but I would argue, in fact, the more interesting story is that of the first Roanoke colony because it tells us a little bit about why Europeans were not able to set up colonies in North America. So a group of English settlers set up Roanoke Colony in 1584 on this island off the coast of modern day North Carolina. And they initially made contact with a group of people called the Roanoke people. Um, and in fact, they sort of set up an initial trade relationship with the Roanokes. And two Roanoke people named Manteo and Wanchese um, actually traveled to England um, and visit England in 1584 1585, and the English there quickly get, like the Spanish and like the French, get involved in sort of local political disputes with a variety of different native nations that existed in on the outer coast of North Carolina. And so there's actually a brief trade dispute with a group of people called the Secotans, who lived down here, southwest of the English settlement, which was here on Roanoke Island. Um, and a epidemic of smallpox actually breaks out among the rival Secotans and Roanokes, um, both of whom actually interpret the disease as direct action taken by the English against them. And so, and ironically, like I mean, no one at the time knew about germ theory, but in some ways they were somewhat right, right? Like if the English weren't there, they would not have been afflicted by smallpox. And so this leads to violence between the Roanokes and the English. And the English do sort of successfully realize that the Roanokes do are attempting to engage in a surprise attack on the English settlement. And so the English surprise the Roanokes first, and then end up actually attacking a meeting between Pemmisapan, who is the leader of the Roanoke people, and other Algonquin groups who are also attempting to plot an attack against the English. And the English do successfully kill many of the leaders of the local Algonquin peoples. Despite the fact that the English are successful in defending themselves, they're not able to secure the colony because without regular trading with the Roanokes and the Secotans for food, they can't survive. And so a local privateer by the name of Sir Francis Drake shows up shortly thereafter, and the settlers basically sort of beg to be taken aboard, and Sir Francis Drake and the settlers get in ships and sail back to England and abandon the colony. In our last stop on our tour of failed European colonies, we'll take a look at Popham Colony, which was established by George Popham, a soldier, and Raleigh Gilbert, an admiral, in 1607 with 100 settlers and 2 captured Wabanakis. Now, they established Popham Colony in the territory of the Wabanaki Nation, which was a powerful nation that existed in modern-day Maine. And the Wabanaki Nation would actually fight many wars against the English well into the 1700s, and the Wabanaki Nation still exists today. And the goal of Popham and Gilbert was to find rare metals like gold and silver. And both Popham and Gilbert did not have really much experience in how to set up a proper colony that could be self-sustaining. And so this group of 100 settlers arrives in late summer of 1607, so they don't have time to actually plant crops. And furthermore, they established their colony on the sort of rocky shores of Maine, which is probably not going to be really good fertile land for growing crops anyway. And so they struggle with hunger and feeding themselves over the course of the winter. And they attempt to reach out to the local Wabanaki people and trade goods for food, but the Wabanaki are not interested whatsoever and basically cut off contact with these settlers. And the only interactions that they even have with the Wabanaki is a few skirmishes and fights. And the problem is, effectively, is that Popham and the other English settlers don't really understand Wabanaki country. They don't understand this is a very cold place where you have to engage in significant fishing and hunting and gathering to survive. And they're hoping to just kind of get by trading with the local people. But the Wabanaki are not interested in trading with the English. And so the colony suffers significantly from hunger. And George Popham actually dies in February of 1608. But the settlers are able to survive the very harsh winter. But by the summer of 1608, they realize they're not going to find any rare metals or anything like that, and they don't have any resources to properly feed themselves. And Gilbert and the other settlers abandoned the colony in 1608, really never to return. And so that is the end, the very short end of Popham Colony in 1608. So why is it that Europeans were not able to establish successful colonies for 100 years in the North American continent, with the sole exception of St. Augustine in Florida? Well, I think there's a variety of different reasons. First, simply, they don't have that much information. They lack the sort of geographical information of these places. They don't often understand native alliances. They routinely get tricked by native leaders into doing things that are not in their interest. And they just have a fundamental misunderstanding of the land as well. And that gets into the second reason of lack of geographical knowledge. Many of these colonies are established in places that are really not great places to live. I mean, Popham colonies on the coast of Maine, which with incredibly harsh winters, that colony was never going to survive. The colony of San Miguel de Guadalupe is established on a place of poor soil, where the settlers infect themselves with dysentery because they can't control their water sources. So poor planning goes into a lot of the reasons why these colonies fail. But another reason is the European colonists do not have the power to conquer these native nations on the coasts. Many of these colonies are wiped out by native peoples, including by the Calusa, by the Timucuans, and effectively by the Wabanaki as well. And so Europeans simply don't have the power to conquer native nations in many parts of North America. And then lastly, the Europeans are attempting to establish these colonies during the Little Ice Age. And the Little Ice Age was a period of climate history in which the world's temperatures dropped by several degrees. And this made for very harsh winters in North America, and cold falls. And so this makes it much harder to grow your own food and to successfully produce enough food to sustain a colony. And so all of these different reasons leads really the 1500s to be a time of significant failed colonies. And so, why do I spend a whole lecture on the failure of colonialism? Well, I think it's very important to understand that Europeans attempted to set up colonies for effectively 100 years and failed. Colonization was not inevitable. It was not this process that was going to happen no matter what. It was contingent. It was dependent on Europeans learning lessons on how to actually set up successful colonies. And it occurred over a long, long period of time. I mean, you're talking about 100 years. That's the same time between the modern day, the Civil War in 1861 to 1865, and the landing of humanity on the moon. So it's really important to understand that colonization was not an inevitable process. And so when we study this history, I think it's important to study not only successful European colonies, but uh, colonies that were massive failures, and understand why these colonies were massive failures. So this will conclude our the first unit of sort of the history of Native America and the history of initial Native and European interactions. And in our second unit, we're going to look at, in more detail into the 1600s and the early 1700s, and how these sort of interactions change as Europeans set up successful colonies that gain a foothold on the North American continent. So I will look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.